Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Joe and I'm the dad.
And I'm Raya, and I'm the daughter. Dad, I just saw your name on our recording session.
You saw my name on the recording session.
Yes, so as we sign in to record on this new podcast platform, mine says Joe and Raya, and yours refers to yourself with a profanity. I don't know why you would call yourself that, but that's how it goes. At the time that we're recording this, a couple days ago, I got in my message box a message from an old friend from church. Something convinced him to reach out to me and see if he can do his best to convince me that I am wrong about being transgender, that this is actually sin, no matter what I think. And can he convince me to what he believes come back to God? I'll give him credit, first of all. That takes a lot of courage to reach out and speak to somebody and tell them, hey, I think that you're wrong. I was as gracious to him as I could be. I engaged him a little bit and I said, well, I understand and I appreciate your concern for me, but here's why you're not right about this. Here's why you're wrong. And I struggled with the Bible for years and years on this. And here's why I've come around. And I wrote a long, long paragraph. And I said, I'm really not interested in discussing this, but I really appreciate your heart to reach out and thanks so much. At first, he kind of let it go for a little bit, but then he came back and he wanted to talk about it some more. And then he threw some more things my way and then some more things my way. And I was really surprised that all of a sudden I was getting bombarded with verses. And I feel like I know my way around the Bible as well as anybody else that I know. It's pretty rare that something comes up that I'm not familiar with or that I don't know. It's also why it took me myself so long to work through the biblical verses to figure out how do you account for them and how do you deal with these in a way that's healthy, because I really wanted to wrestle with what does the Bible say? We got to the point where essentially I had refuted everything that he said, but he kept coming back and basically saying, I don't agree with you. I don't care.
I would say to you, you need to set boundaries with grace. So you could say to him something like, I respect your faith and I ask you to respect mine. I don't believe that God rejects me or anyone based on gender identity. I mean, doesn't that make sense?
Yeah.
And you could say, I'm not here to debate. If you care about me, I need you to show love, not condemnation.
Yes. How I ended up closing the conversation is I said, I know you can't see this. It's why I'm being gracious with this conversation. But you are calling evil good and good evil, and then you're accusing me of doing the same. He responded, he said, God did not create you trans. And then I said, you keep saying that and you keep being wrong.
Right.
But the reason I wanted to talk about this here right now is because it didn't matter what I said. He wasn't there for a two-way discussion. In his mind, he was right and I was wrong. And anything less than him convincing me of that was a failure on his part. And he was just going to keep coming back at me again and again and again. It just didn't matter what I said. And ultimately, I said, I'm done with this conversation. We're not going to talk about it any longer. And that's kind of how it went. The thing that I was so surprised by is remembering those old feelings that I had when I was in a conservative church. And when you're in that, that can be really confusing. It can feel like I don't know who to trust because this is my family. These are my people. This is my community. If my family is telling me that I'm in sin just for being who I am, shouldn't I really be listening to them and paying attention to what they say? And part of me feels like that can't be right because it's who I am on the inside. And I listen to podcasts like Transcendent, or I have other affirming voices in my life, but how do I know that they're not the voices that are leading me astray? Right? Because my family is telling me, well, that's just the voice of the enemy, and the enemy can be really sneaky. I want to talk through some strategies of how we can make our way through that confusion. Because I don't want you to just assume if you're listening right now that, well, Raya and Joe have it all figured out, because we don't. And I don't want you thinking, well, I have to just listen to the voices in my church because they must have it right. All that is a debate between two groups of people telling you, no, don't listen to them, listen to us. How can you know that you are following reality rather than following somebody that's trying to lead you astray? I think there are some principles that you can actually turn to that then you can judge everything that we say and everything that your community is telling you in light of those principles. And I think that this can function a little bit like a compass pointing you to your true north so that you're not just wandering around trying to figure out how do you find your freedom.
Well, you could remind him, for example, that Jesus never spoke about LGBTQ people, but he did emphasize love, justice, and humility. And you just ask somebody, wait a minute, if God's love is unconditional, why would my identity change that?
Right.
Logic says it wouldn't.
Love is the most important thing. If you're immersed in the Bible and you've read it even a little bit, you know that in the Old Testament, you've got law after law after law, and do this and do this and do this. And then when you get to the Gospels, you see Jesus telling an entirely different story. That all of a sudden, he is confronting all of the religious people saying, you have to live this way and that way and this way and that way. And what was he confronting them for? It's because they had lost that core value of love. They
Oh,
had
sure.
lost the piece that was saying what matters are humans. And they had focused instead on the rules, and they were no longer valuing the human lives that were involved. That was the whole reason why the rules were put there to begin with.
I had a conversation with another pastor, not my pastor, but another pastor. We're social friends. And I asked him, I said, wait a minute, my faith brings me peace and joy. If yours leads you to condemn others, I'd just like you to reflect on that. I'd rather focus on how we can love and support each other rather than argue about who's right. I think that really is the message that I see over and over and over. If you look back in history, I've seen many arguments that use the Bible to support their point of view. But when it's a point of view that hates the other person, that just doesn't make sense to me. It just feels so wrong. When you experience joy, it is the most profound faith. Everybody else has their own interpretation and they change over and over. Just think back in the 1860s and how people fought to keep slavery because it was right. Oh, the Bible said all of this about slavery and it's right. Well, we know now that's not true. I've seen arguments in so many ways just defending points of view that we now know are completely illogical.
Love has got to be the core of all of these things. But this thing that I'm most surprised by is you can tell when somebody's being loving because they have your best interest at heart. But what I find is that the people that are the least loving, especially in religious communities, are the ones that are the quickest to tell you how loving they are. And why do they have to tell you how loving they are?
Because if they didn't tell you, you wouldn't know.
That's right. When you have a toxic, spiritually abusive church, you see ways to manipulate the things that should make us more loving in an effort to gain more control or to gain more power over the way that you live. There's four characteristics that you'll see of a toxic church that violate the principle of love. First, you see in a toxic church that they will demand loyalty to the leaders, whereas in a healthy community, they encourage you to question and to have dialogue. In a toxic community, they will prioritize institutional rules over the people. But in a healthy community, they will value the people over the policies. In a toxic community, they'll use secrecy and they'll spin things. But in a healthy community, they practice transparency. In a toxic community, they will equate dissent with disobedience. Oh, how dare you think outside of what we have always thought and what we have always taught. But in a healthy community, they will welcome critical thinking.
I think of two examples of the toxic communities. One was Jim Jones in Central America, and he had all these followers. And at the end, they found all the people were dead. He had given them Kool Aid, and then now you even hear the expression, he drank the Kool Aid, and they did. And another one I was thinking of was David Koresh in Waco, Texas, where he was in this compound, and ultimately he burned it down with the people inside. That's what did you say that is? That's a toxic church?
A toxic church. When I was in a conservative church, I never thought that our church was trying to be toxic. I don't think that the leaders thought to themselves, we want to try to be manipulative towards other people. I think that they really believed everything that they were saying and legitimately wanted to change the world. I have no doubt about it. And I became part of that because I wanted to also change the world. So I know that I had a good heart, and I believe that the leaders that I was working with also had a good heart. They wanted to do the right thing. But for me, my step out, my very first step, I remember that day. I had been talking with somebody else who was dealing with her own toxic church. And I asked her, do you think that your faith and your participation in your community has made you a better person or a worse person? And she gave her response to me, and oh, yeah, I'll think about that. Well, that night, I remember driving into church because I was about to lead worship practice. So that because the worship team would be leading the church on Sunday morning. And I was driving in as the worship leader. And I was thinking about that and going over and over in my mind. And I asked myself that same question. Has my church community and the faith that I have established in this church community that views the Bible in this way, has this made me a better person, a more loving person, or has it made me a worse person? And I thought to myself, of all of the people that I felt like I needed to stand in judgment over them and to figure out if they were the right kind of Christian, the right kind of person, did they have the right kind of faith? And I thought to myself, that was not at all the heart that you see when you read the stories in the gospel. Jesus was never going around saying, are you the right kind of person? He would show love and unconditional acceptance towards people. The people that he was most judgmental towards were the people that were prioritizing the rules ahead of people. The people
I
that were saying, well, you're not following the Sabbath law the right way. And he said, hey, wait a minute. If you have a horse or a donkey or an animal, you're out on the farm and it's the Sabbath and they walk out of the barn and they fall into a hole, are you going to say, well, it's the Sabbath, I'm going to let that animal die? No, of course not. You're going to go help that animal because you care about them. Well, how much more should we care about humans?
it's really all about caring and trying to understand the other person's point of view. Going back to the very beginning of this podcast, you get someone who wanted to tell you where you're wrong, but didn't want to discuss or see another point of view. That's one of the things that God does is gives us the ability to look at other points of view. The other thing God doesn't give us the right to judge. That's not for us.
And so if you're in that situation right now, the first compass or the first pointing to true north that you can look at is, where do you find love? But that's not the only thing. And we're going to talk about the other compass that you can use after this.
I am Mark Zemer, a listener and supporter of Transcendent. I've been a Lutheran pastor for 45 years, and oh, what a journey that was for me to understand the LGBTQIA community and what that meant. I was so not understanding and hurtful. So, this podcast is incredibly important to really educate and understand and to hold relationships together. So I urge you to consider listening, of course, but also supporting. You can go to transcendent.com and click on the heart with a support button. You can give as little as $3 a month, and you can cancel at any time. Important for all of us on this journey of understanding, keeping relationships together, truly being people of love.
The next thing we ought to take a look at is, does what we're doing promote health? Well, certainly, John 10:10, Jesus says, I've come that you should have life and have it in the full. What does that mean? Does that mean that we should be beat down and beat further down because we're never going to be there, never towing the line? Or does it mean that we need to just understand that God loves us no matter where we are and what we're doing? One of my greatest examples is the thief on the cross. All he said was, I believe you. I don't know what happened to him in the past. God loves us and he's always there for us.
When I was first making this journey myself, it was a big eye opener when I first thought about approaching these issues through the question of health and what is healthy. Because until that point, my community of faith had taught me only to view these issues through the lens of authority and what they had told me was true. But when I stopped and asked myself, what is healthy? That's objective. You can actually look at it and you can test and see this is healthier and this is less healthy. And so, for instance, where do LGBTQ people find that they live the most flourishing lives? Is it in the context of church communities telling them that it's wrong to be gay or lesbian or transgender? Now, ironically, we find that every single category of person is generally healthier when they engage in a religious community, except for LGBTQ people. There was a study that ran in 2018. It was published in the American Journal for Preventive Medicine. It was called Association of Religiosity with Sexual Minorities, Suicide Ideation and Attempt.
Boy, that's a mouthful.
Isn't it? And they studied the connection between being gay or lesbian or bisexual or questioning and the likelihood that somebody would commit self-harm. And what they found is that there was no relation between the two if somebody was not a part of one of these religious communities. But when somebody rated religious importance as highly important to them, they felt the strongest effects. They were much, much more likely to have recent suicide ideation. In other words, they had thought about it, or a recent attempt, or lifetime attempts. If the things that the religious community is saying are really true, wouldn't we also see it being the healthiest life for people? But instead, we actually see it being the least healthy life for people in our community. That to me is a big indication of where do I need to go? Because if I'm a part of a community that continues to tell me that for no fault of my own, for nothing that I do, but just for wanting to live my own authentic life that's not hurting anyone, that is not acting unloving towards my neighbor, but that I am wrong, there's something that is deeply dehumanizing about that.
When we talk about who's right and who's wrong, it seems as though all of us sometimes just dig in our heels. But in reality, if you keep an open mind and you realize when we're talking about Christianity, what does the Bible really say about some of these things? There are so many things that people can use one way or the other. For example, they'll say, "Well, God created mankind in His own image, male and female. He created them. So the point is, there's only that and nothing else." Well, this verse it poetically describes humanity. It's not rigid categories. The phrase male and female is a literary device that expresses totality, not limitation. It's like saying day and night to mean all the time, not just those two moments, day and night. Intersex people exist naturally. So even biologically, sex is not binary. If God's image includes all humanity, that means trans people are also reflections of God. That makes complete sense to me. And I think it does to a lot of our listeners out there as well. It's not what somebody else tells you they believe and you're wrong. It's what really is the truth out there. It's so difficult, I feel, for people who get beat down and beat down and beat down, thinking, oh, they're wrong. Oh, this is terrible. And it's a sad situation that many of those people is much higher than the people who are not involved in the very conservative churches, that those people have a much higher rate of attempted and actually performed suicide. That is so sad. I do not believe that God wants that for us. He wants us to live a joyful life. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus said, I came that you should have life and have it in the full. Now, if you're in some situation where you're struggling and you're beat down and they keep telling you this is wrong, you've probably already discovered that it's impossible to change. And are you going to be able to have life in its full? No, I don't think that is going to happen. Instead, we've heard some of these podcasts here where Raya said how wrong she felt being in the body she was and how it was obvious that this is something she had to do. She gave up everything, her entire life that she built, to do this because it was the only thing that was going to be a step in the direction to give her life in the full. That is a powerful, powerful message to all of us. And I'm thankful that that verse is in there.
Boy, Dad, it is so good to hear you talking like this. If you're a listener right now, you maybe don't have a parent that is affirming or a grandparent that's affirming, and it feels like, what am I going to do? And you can listen to the voice of my dad as your surrogate dad. He can be your voice of affirmation. The communities that are supposed to be lifting us up, that are supposed to be protecting us and there for us are the ones that can so often let us down. And if you're still in that place where you're not sure how you're feeling and what you're thinking, just remember other places where our viewpoints on things have changed. For instance, imagine what your physical health would have been like in the 1800s or the 1700s, and how different things have been, how health has changed as we have learned so much more. I remember that old sketch on Saturday Night Live with Steve Martin. Do you remember this one, Dad, with Theodoric of York? He was the barber.
Yes.
And people would come to him, and it was a medieval barber, which back in those days you get your hair cut and then you do a good bloodletting. And that was supposed to heal you. And that was the whole gag of the thing, was all of the goofy advice that he would give, which was so clearly not in line with anything scientific. And he said at one point, medicine is not an exact science, but we are learning all the time. Why, just 50 years ago, they thought a disease like your daughter's was caused by demonic possession or witchcraft. But nowadays, we know that Isabel is suffering from an imbalance of bodily humors, perhaps caused by a toad or a small dwarf living in her stomach. And it's easy for us to laugh right now. And yet, when you are in a toxic community, a spiritually abusive community, it is so easy to be confused and not know which direction to go. And maybe you've been told that you have a demonic possession, or that you have been the recipient of witchcraft. All of those things, it is spiritual abuse. But I'll tell you one thing that is never spiritual abuse and will never cause you to have a toad or a small dwarf living in your stomach. And that is this podcast. We hope we've given you some tips to help you on your own journey to counteract that spiritual abuse, because every one of us deserves to live the life that we were created to live and to be our most authentic selves, because that's when we are happiest, that's when we are most full of joy, and that's when we thrive.
And with that, we'll see you Monday.